December 16th, 1985 rush hour in Manhattan. Outside Sparks Steakhouse, gunfire erupted. The powerful boss of America's largest mafia family, Paul Castellano, was gunned down in the street. Witnesses were stunned, but inside the underworld, everyone knew what this meant. The Gambino Crime Family, once a quiet empire built by Carlo Gambino, had just been taken over by John Gotti, the man who would become the most famous mob boss in modern history. And before we dive into this incredible story of power, betrayal, and downfall, remember, over 99% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you enjoy deep dives into history's most powerful empires, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Now, this is the rise and fall of the Gambino crime family. Carlo Gambino arrived in the United States in 1921, one of thousands of Sicilian immigrants stepping onto Ellis Island. To the government at the time, he was just another young man looking for work in America. There was no criminal record, no evidence to suggest that decades later he would become one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. Through the 1920s and 1930s, federal attention was focused on bootlegging and tax evasion cases, most famously the conviction of Al Capone. Men like Gambino avoided notice precisely because they lived quietly. While federal agents monitored high-profile gangsters, Gambino built connections in Brooklyn without headlines, arrests, or investigations. By the 1940s, agencies such as the FBI began to expand their surveillance of Italian-American organized crime. Files were created on suspected racketeers, and wiretaps became an important tool. Yet Carlo Gambino's name rarely appeared. Unlike Albert Anastasia or Vito Genovese, Gambino didn't draw public attention. For government investigators, this made him difficult to track and even harder to prosecute. When Gambino became underboss in the Mangano family, the FBI noted his presence, but underestimated his influence. Reports from the time describe him as quiet, reserved, and difficult to evaluate. His modest lifestyle in Brooklyn did not fit the profile of a powerful figure. For years, this worked to his advantage. While the Bureau targeted bosses who flaunted wealth or displayed violence, Gambino was able to consolidate power almost unnoticed. By 1957, when Albert Anastasia was assassinated in Manhattan, the FBI had already increased its monitoring of organized crime families. Congressional hearings on racketeering, particularly those led by Senator Estes Kefauver, brought public attention to the Mafia. In those hearings, however, Carlo Gambino's name was barely mentioned. He was a shadow figure, one step ahead of investigators who were still piecing together the hierarchy of New York's 5 families. Once Gambino assumed control of the family, the Bureau began to pay closer attention. Agents documented his meetings, his involvement in labor unions, and his influence on waterfront industries. Still, despite mounting files and years of observation, prosecutors struggled to bring strong cases against him. He was rarely caught on tape, avoided incriminating conversations, and relied on layers of intermediaries. To investigators, he became known as a man who was always present but never directly exposed. Throughout the 1960s, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover finally acknowledged the existence of the American Mafia as a nationwide structure. Carlo Gambino was identified as one of its key leaders. Even so, he managed to outlast indictments, hearings, and government campaigns. Unlike many of his contemporaries, He never faced a lengthy prison sentence. When he died in 1976, federal agencies recognized him as the most successful boss of his era, not because he was untouchable, but because he had perfected the art of staying just beyond their reach. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, federal agencies were already keeping close watch on his family. The FBI had long known he was the most cautious and successful of all bosses, but even in his final years, agents admitted they never managed to build a solid case strong enough to put him away. His passing created a new question for law enforcement. Who would take his place, and would the new boss be easier to track? The answer came quickly. Gambino had named his cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, as his successor. To the public, Castellano was not a familiar name. To investigators, he was already on their radar. They knew him as a man deeply involved in labor racketeering and the construction industry, particularly through the concrete business. His Staten Island mansion and wealthy lifestyle made him stand out in ways Gambino never had. For the FBI, this was a turning point. Castellano wasn't the quiet Don. He projected an image of wealth and power, something agents immediately recognized as a weakness. Surveillance teams monitored his mansion, his meetings, and his businesses. Unlike Carlo Gambino, who moved silently, Castellano's position as a corporate-style boss meant his activities left more of a trail. Still, building a case wasn't simple. Castellano rarely handled day-to-day street operations. He delegated that work to his captains, keeping himself focused on higher-level profits. This layer of insulation made it difficult for prosecutors to connect him directly to criminal acts. But the FBI adapted. They turned to new tools: long-term surveillance, undercover informants, and most importantly, wiretaps. During the late 1970s, law enforcement pressure on organized crime increased nationwide. The passage of the RICO Act, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, gave prosecutors a powerful weapon. For the first time, they could charge leaders not just for specific crimes, but for running criminal enterprises as organizations. Castellano's family, with its control of unions and industries, was a prime target. Agents began focusing on his business dealings, especially the so-called Concrete Club, a scheme in which major construction companies were forced to work with mob-approved contractors. The FBI carefully documented patterns of bid rigging and price fixing. Every piece of evidence was designed to tie Castellano personally to the profits, showing that he was not just a distant overseer, but an active participant. Now, meanwhile, internal tensions within the family began to draw even more attention from law enforcement. Younger members of the organization resented Castellano's leadership style, which they saw as too focused on white-collar profits and too distant from the traditional street operations. The FBI, always monitoring, noted the divisions and prepared for the possibility of violent conflict. By the early 1980s, Castellano was firmly established as boss, but his visibility and lifestyle contrasted sharply with Gambino's careful low profile. For federal agencies, this made him both easier to follow and a higher-value target. He was, in their eyes, the symbol of organized crime's deep reach into legitimate industries. Every surveillance photo, every recorded conversation, and every meeting observed by agents was added to growing case files. For Castellano, the danger wasn't just from law enforcement, it was also from within his own organization, where ambitious figures like John Gotti were waiting for a chance to act. Agents monitoring both men sensed the collision was inevitable. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, this would mark the beginning of one of the most visible and heavily documented shifts in the history of the Gambino crime family. John Gotti's rise didn't just mark a change inside the Gambino family, it marked a change in how the government viewed and pursued organized crime. For years, the FBI had studied the family under Carlo Gambino and then Paul Castellano. They knew it was the largest and most influential of the five families. But when Gotti emerged, he was unlike any boss federal agents had seen before. He was visible, defiant, and openly confident. Where Carlo Gambino had been silent and Castellano had been calculating, Gotti stepped into the spotlight. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, this wasn't just a criminal investigation anymore, it was a public test of authority. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, surveillance had already hinted at unrest within the Gambino family. Agents monitoring Castellano's home and meetings noticed growing distance between the traditional leadership and certain younger captains. Among them was John Gotti, a Queens-born figure who, unlike Castellano, never disguised his street origins. He represented the rank and file who felt Castellano was more concerned with business suits and construction contracts than the realities of street operations. FBI analysts began to consider whether the family might fracture. They weren't wrong. By 1985, federal prosecutors had been closing in on Castellano. Wiretaps in his Staten Island mansion revealed conversations about business deals and internal disputes. The evidence was enough for an indictment. Castellano was charged under RICO statutes, with prosecutors arguing that his control of unions and construction companies was part of a criminal enterprise. For the Justice Department, this was a chance to finally bring down one of the Mafia's most powerful leaders. For Gotti and his faction, it was an opening. Castellano's arrest weakened his authority at the very moment when younger figures wanted change. The FBI didn't know it at the time, but Gotti and his allies were already planning what would become one of the most famous power shifts in Mafia history. In December 1985, as Castellano arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, gunmen ambushed and killed him along with his driver. Federal agents monitoring the family had predicted conflict, but they hadn't anticipated such a bold and public move. Within days, surveillance teams noticed the shift. Associates who had once reported to Castellano were now making visits to Gotti's headquarters in Queens. For the FBI, it was confirmation. John Gotti had taken control of the Gambino family. From the government's perspective, Gotti's arrival was both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, he was a more visible target than Castellano. He held court in social clubs, appeared in public, dressed in tailored suits, and even smiled for cameras outside courtrooms. On the other hand, that same visibility made him harder to ignore. Prosecutors and agents understood that unless they found a way to convict him, his image as untouchable would grow not just among his own associates, but in the public imagination. Almost immediately, law enforcement intensified its focus. The FBI's New York office increased surveillance around Gotti's known hangouts, particularly the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy. Teams rotated outside, recording license plates, photographing visitors, and building charts of associations. Inside, electronic bugs were planted though early attempts yielded limited results. Gotti was careful with what he said indoors, often taking walks outside to avoid microphones. For agents, it was a frustrating cat and mouse game. Yet Gotti's courtroom battles soon became a stage for the Justice Department. In 1986, he was tried for racketeering, assault, and conspiracy. The case relied heavily on the testimony of informants and circumstantial evidence. When the jury returned with a not guilty verdict, newspapers splashed Gotti's image across front pages with the nickname the Teflon Don. For prosecutors, it was a bitter defeat. For Gotti, it was a victory he embraced publicly, shaking hands outside the courthouse and reinforcing the perception that the government couldn't touch him. The FBI responded by adjusting strategy. Instead of relying on short-term cases, they doubled down on long-term intelligence. They placed hidden microphones not just in social clubs, but in the homes and meeting spots of Gotti's closest associates. Informants were cultivated carefully with the hope of penetrating the inner circle. Meanwhile, prosecutors like Rudolph Giuliani pushed for broader use of RICO charges, knowing that a single count of conspiracy might not be enough to convict someone as insulated as Gotti. The turning point came with Gotti's underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Law enforcement had identified Gravano as both loyal and dangerous, but as investigations intensified, cracks began to show. Prosecutors realized that if Gravano could be convinced to cooperate, Gotti's shield of insulation would collapse. It took years of pressure, surveillance, and indictments, but by the early 1990s, Gravano agreed to testify. For the Justice Department, it was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. In 1992, John Gotti stood trial again, this time with Gravano as the star witness. The government's case was meticulous. They presented recorded conversations, surveillance logs, and Gravano's insider testimony. Unlike earlier trials, the evidence was overwhelming. Jurors saw the contrast. A man who had evaded conviction for years now facing undeniable proof of his role in ordering murders, extortion, and racketeering. The verdict was guilty on all counts. John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, the conviction was more than just another case. It was the culmination of decades of effort to bring down the most powerful organized crime family in America. It proved that the tools developed under the RICO Act, combined with persistent surveillance and strategic use of informants, could succeed where earlier prosecutions had failed. In press conferences, officials made clear that the era of Mafia bosses living beyond the reach of the law was over. Inside law enforcement circles, the Gotti case became a study in persistence. Early setbacks, like the Teflon Don acquittals, had nearly convinced some that he couldn't be touched. But the eventual conviction showed the value of patience and innovation. Agents who had spent nights outside social clubs listening to hours of muffled recordings finally saw results. Prosecutors who had faced hostile juries and failed indictments now had proof that their strategy could work. Gotti's downfall also reshaped the public's view of the Mafia. For years, his high-profile lifestyle had made him a figure of fascination. But his imprisonment revealed the cost of that visibility. Unlike Gambino, who had ruled in the shadows, or Castellano, who had tried to blend legitimate business with underworld control, Gotti's openness drew the spotlight of law enforcement until it consumed him. In the years that followed, the FBI used the lessons from the Gotti case to target other families. Wiretaps became standard, RICO cases multiplied, and the once dominant five families faced relentless legal pressure. The Gambino family, once at the height of its power, entered a new era of decline. For the Justice Department, Gotti's conviction wasn't just the end of one man's reign, it was proof that the government could dismantle even the most entrenched criminal empires. The conviction of John Gotti in 1992 was not the end of the government's battle against organized crime in many ways. It was just the beginning of a new phase. For the FBI, the Justice Department, and local prosecutors, the trial had demonstrated that even the most high-profile mafia boss could be brought down. But it also revealed something more. Organized crime was not a single figure nor a single family. It was a network, one that stretched across industries, unions, and even international borders. If the government wanted to dismantle it permanently, it would have to shift from focusing on individuals to dismantling entire systems. This realization gave birth to a new era in federal strategy. The lessons from the Gambino prosecutions became a blueprint applied against all five families of New York: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno. Each had its own history, its own leadership, and its own rackets, but all shared similar vulnerabilities: reliance on secrecy, dependence on union and business infiltration, and susceptibility to betrayal from within. The FBI understood that the victory against Gotti would mean little if the other families were left untouched. The campaign had to be citywide and eventually nationwide. The RICO Act became the centerpiece of this strategy. Enacted in 1970 but underutilized in its early years, RICO allowed prosecutors to charge leaders for the actions of their subordinates, treating criminal organizations as enterprises rather than loose collections of individuals. In the past, mafia bosses had evaded justice by insulating themselves, issuing orders indirectly, communicating through layers of intermediaries, and avoiding any direct involvement in crimes. With RICO, that insulation was no longer enough. Wiretaps, surveillance, and testimony from insiders could be woven into a narrative showing that a boss directed and profited from a criminal enterprise. The Gotti case had proven its effectiveness, and now it was applied relentlessly. Through the 1990s, major indictments struck each of the five families. The Colombo family, weakened by internal wars, faced federal charges that decimated its leadership. The Bonanno family saw its boss, Joseph Massino, convicted in the early 2000s after years of FBI surveillance. In an unprecedented move, Massino himself became a government witness, testifying against his former associates. For the FBI, this was proof that even the old code of silence, once thought unbreakable, was vulnerable. The Genovese family, long considered the most secretive and disciplined, was also not immune. Though its leaders avoided the public spotlight that had doomed Gotti, federal investigations into labor racketeering and Wall Street schemes exposed their operations. The Lucchese family, tied to trucking and garment industries, also faced steady indictments. Each case chipped away at the infrastructure that had once allowed the Mafia to operate as a shadow government in New York. The strategy wasn't just about prosecutions. It was about partnerships. The FBI worked closely with the NYPD, state authorities, and federal prosecutors to coordinate efforts. Task forces combined local street-level knowledge with federal investigative tools, ensuring that no case fell through the cracks. International cooperation also expanded. Italian authorities, facing their own battle against Cosa Nostra and later 'Ndrangheta, began sharing intelligence with U.S. agencies. Wiretaps in Palermo could connect directly to investigations in Brooklyn. Money trails followed across the Atlantic, and joint operations disrupted drug pipelines and financial schemes. Technology played an increasingly critical role. Surveillance had evolved far beyond what was available in Carlo Gambino's era. Hidden microphones were now more sophisticated, capable of capturing conversations in noisy environments. Cameras could be disguised in everyday objects. Digital monitoring opened new avenues. Emails, financial transactions, and electronic records all became part of the investigative arsenal. Where once the Mafia had relied on face-to-face meetings to preserve secrecy, even those could be compromised by the silent presence of a wire hidden in a lamp or a bug planted in a car. But perhaps the most significant weapon remained human intelligence informants and cooperating witnesses. After Gravano and later Massino, the floodgates opened. Prosecutors learned how to leverage long sentences against mid- and high-ranking members, offering deals in exchange for cooperation. Each new witness provided details about hierarchy, operations, and methods of communication. The once iron code of silence, omerta, became increasingly fragile. For the Gambino family in particular, waves of turncoats in the 1990s and 2000s eroded its ability to function effectively. The government also understood that organized crime adapted. When traditional rackets like hijacking and loan sharking became riskier, the families turned to white-collar crime. Stock fraud, healthcare scams, credit card schemes, and internet fraud emerged as new ventures. The FBI responded by expanding its financial crime units. Agents who once tracked drug shipments now traced wire transfers. Prosecutors who had built cases on surveillance photos learned to build them on spreadsheets. The battlefield had shifted, but the strategy, persistence, intelligence, and RICO prosecutions remained the same. For the public, this era transformed the Mafia's image. In the 1970s and 1980s, headlines about Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, and John Gotti portrayed bosses as figures of enormous power. By the late 1990s and 2000s, headlines focused more on indictments, guilty pleas, and long prison terms. The myth of invulnerability faded. Ordinary New Yorkers, once living under the shadow of Mafia influence in unions, construction, and even politics, began to see the power of these families diminish. For law enforcement, this was not just about arrests. It was about changing the perception of organized crime from unstoppable to vulnerable. One of the largest demonstrations of federal power came in 2008, when dozens of Gambino family members and associates were indicted in a sweeping case. The charges ranged from extortion and racketeering to murder conspiracies. Prosecutors described it as a strike aimed at cutting off the family's remaining leadership. For the FBI, it was a culmination of years of work, hundreds of hours of surveillance, dozens of informants, and a coordinated strike across multiple states. The message was clear. No matter how the family tried to rebuild, the government would be waiting. Yet even with these successes, federal agents remained realistic. Organized crime was not eradicated. It still existed, though diminished, and often in quieter forms. Smaller crews operated independently, sometimes without the hierarchical structure of the past. International networks filled gaps, linking American families to drug cartels and overseas syndicates. The FBI shifted focus again, now treating organized crime as part of a broader global threat that included terrorism and transnational gangs. The fight against the Mafia had provided a blueprint for investigating networks that operated across borders and adapted quickly. Looking back, federal officials often pointed to the Gambino case as the pivotal moment. It was the trial of John Gotti that proved patience and persistence could overcome public image and courtroom defeats. It was the decline of the Gambinos that showed how relentless pressure could dismantle even the largest family, and it was the broader war on the five families that demonstrated the effectiveness of combining surveillance, RICO, informants, and international cooperation. By the early 21st century, the Mafia no longer controlled New York the way it once had. Construction contracts were monitored, unions were reformed, and political corruption was harder to conceal. The fear that once kept witnesses silent had been replaced by a steady flow of cooperation with law enforcement. The families remained, but they were smaller, weaker, and far less influential. For the FBI and the Justice Department, this was considered one of the greatest long-term successes in the history of federal law enforcement. But the war was never declared finished. Organized crime in one form or another continued to exist. The faces changed, the methods evolved, and the profits came from new sources. Yet the legacy of the FBI's war on the five families lived on in every major case the government pursued thereafter. Whether against drug cartels, terrorist cells, or cybercrime rings, the strategies refined in the battle against the Gambinos shaped modern federal investigations. The tools of surveillance, the patience of long-term investigations, and the willingness to flip insiders became standard practice. For historians and investigators alike, the story was clear. The rise and fall of the Gambino family was not just the tale of a single crime group. It was the story of how government agencies learned, adapted, and ultimately overcame one of the most entrenched criminal organizations in American history. The legacy of that battle is written not just in the convictions and indictments, but in the very structure of law enforcement today. When the Gambino family's grip on New York began to weaken under unrelenting federal pressure in the 1990s, the FBI and other government agencies realized that organized crime was no longer a purely local or even national phenomenon. The influence of the five families extended far beyond the streets of Brooklyn or Manhattan. To dismantle the Gambino Empire and prevent it from resurfacing in new forms, law enforcement had to think globally. For decades, investigators knew that the American Mafia maintained ties with its Sicilian roots. The Gambinos, in particular, were linked with the powerful Mafia clans in Palermo and other parts of Sicily. These connections weren't just symbolic. They were practical, involving alliances in narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and the use of international contacts to hide assets. The FBI recognized that tackling this kind of cross-border network required cooperation with Italian law enforcement, including the legendary anti-mafia prosecutors and investigators who were themselves fighting bloody wars against organized crime in the 1980s and 1990s. A turning point came when U.S. authorities and Italian counterparts began sharing intelligence systematically. Joint investigations revealed how profits from American rackets were funneled back to Sicilian partners, and vice versa. For the FBI, these partnerships marked a new era of international policing, showing that the Gambino family could no longer operate in isolation. Every wire transfer, every overseas meeting, and every suspicious import became part of a larger picture of transnational organized crime. At the same time, the fall of the Soviet Union introduced a new competitor to the underworld, Russian organized crime. For agencies like the FBI, which had once focused so much of their resources on the Italian-American Mafia, this was a wake-up call. Russian groups moved quickly into New York's neighborhoods, engaging in schemes ranging from gasoline tax fraud to high-level financial crimes. In some cases, investigators suspected that fragments of the Gambino network cooperated with these new players. Surveillance units tracked meetings between old Gambino associates and Russian operatives, looking for evidence of alliances. Though the partnerships were often fragile, they underscored a sobering reality. Organized crime adapts quickly, and where one power fades, another rises. Latin America also became part of the picture. By the late 20th century, Colombian and Mexican cartels dominated the drug trade. For the Gambinos, who had traditionally avoided direct involvement in narcotics on a large scale, this represented both a temptation and a danger. While some members explored connections with traffickers, the FBI's narcotics division was already embedded in cartel investigations, ensuring that any potential alliances were closely scrutinized. Federal agents recognized that while the Mafia's influence was declining, the networks it had built still offered a framework for others to exploit. International financial crime posed another challenge. With advances in banking and digital transfers, money could be moved across borders in seconds, far from the physical surveillance methods that had once helped the FBI track suitcases of cash. Gambino associates, like other crime groups, experimented with offshore accounts, shell companies, and international real estate. To counter this, U.S. agencies began working closely with financial regulators in Europe and the Caribbean, building systems to flag unusual transactions. The FBI's financial crimes units, born in part from lessons learned in the fight against the Mafia, became crucial players in uncovering these hidden movements of wealth. By the early 2000s, the Gambino family was no longer the dominant force it had once been, but fragments of its structure still existed. Some members continued low-level rackets. Others sought to integrate into new global schemes. Law enforcement saw this as both a lingering threat and a case study in resilience. The very fact that agencies could still identify Gambino-linked activity decades after Carlo Gambino's quiet reign spoke to how deeply the family's name had embedded itself in criminal history. For federal agencies, the challenge wasn't just dismantling the old order. It was preventing new hybrids of organized crime from taking root. International cooperation became routine, with FBI liaisons stationed overseas and foreign agents embedded in U.S. investigations. The fight against the Gambinos helped shape these new methods, showing that no single country could tackle transnational crime alone. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this era was the adaptability of law enforcement itself. The same patient surveillance and intelligence sharing that had once brought down figures like Gotti were now being applied on a global scale. Instead of monitoring a social club in Little Italy, agents were tracing encrypted phone calls between continents. Instead of watching cash pass hands in Brooklyn, they were decoding financial trails that spanned the globe. The methods had changed, But the mission remained the same, to ensure that no family, no matter how powerful, could operate above the law. By the mid-2000s, reports described the Gambino family as a shadow of its former self, struggling to remain relevant in a world where new criminal empires had risen. Yet, in law enforcement circles, the Gambino name carried weight, not because of its power in the present, but because of the lessons it provided for the future. It stood as a reminder that organized crime is never truly defeated, only contained, and that government vigilance must constantly evolve. For nearly a century, the Gambino crime family represented both the peak of organized crime in America and the persistence of law enforcement in dismantling it. From Carlo Gambino's quiet empire building to John Gotti's flamboyant downfall, the family's history offers one of the clearest examples of how patience, strategy, and evolving investigative tools can bring even the most powerful organizations to their knees. By the early 21st century, the Gambinos were no longer the untouchable force they once seemed. Instead, their name had become a symbol, one of both fear and fascination, but also of the relentless pursuit of justice. The family's decline didn't happen overnight. It was the result of decades of pressure, much of it invisible to the public. Surveillance teams spent endless hours monitoring meetings, cataloging associates, and following leads that sometimes went nowhere. Prosecutors assembled cases one small piece at a time, often knowing that a single error could unravel years of work. Informants, once reluctant to break the code of silence, gradually came forward, protected by federal witness programs that reshaped the landscape of organized crime investigations. Each of these tools chipped away at the foundation of Gambino power until what once seemed immovable began to crumble. For the government, the downfall of the Gambinos validated a long-held belief that no one is beyond the reach of the law. The same family that had once infiltrated unions, industries, and even politics had been exposed in courtrooms, reduced in strength, and forced into the shadows. This wasn't just a victory against one organization. It was a demonstration that patient, methodical law enforcement could take on institutions that had thrived for generations. The cultural legacy of the Gambinos also played a role. Media coverage of figures like John Gotti turned trials into spectacles, capturing national attention. For the FBI and federal prosecutors, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. The glare of publicity made investigations more difficult at times, but it also showed the public why organized crime had to be confronted. When Gotti was finally convicted, it was not only a legal victory, but also a symbolic one. It reassured the American people that even the so-called Teflon Don could be held accountable. By the 2000s, law enforcement assessments described the Gambino family as weakened and fragmented. Some remnants continued small-scale rackets, but the grand power structures of the past were gone. Younger generations were more reluctant to enter a life that had once seemed glamorous, but now led mostly to indictments and prison sentences. Federal agencies, meanwhile, had moved forward, applying lessons from the Mafia wars to new fronts: counterterrorism, cybercrime, financial fraud, and transnational cartels. The techniques developed against the Gambinos, wiretaps, RICO cases, long-term surveillance, were now standard tools in combating global threats. And yet, the Gambino legacy persists in a different way. The name is etched into American history, studied in criminology courses, and dissected in documentaries. For the FBI, the story is a case study in perseverance. For the public, it is a reminder of a time when shadowy figures seemed to control entire cities. For lawmakers, it underscored the importance of giving investigators the legal tools they needed, from RICO statutes to witness protection programs. The greatest legacy, however, lies in the balance between myth and reality. The Gambinos were often romanticized in popular culture, portrayed as larger-than-life figures in suits and fedoras. But the true story, as law enforcement records reveal, is one of greed, betrayal, and the slow erosion of an empire under the weight of government scrutiny. The contrast between the Hollywood image and the courtroom transcripts is stark, and it is in that gap that the lessons of history are found. Today, the Gambino family exists mostly as a shadow of its former self. Occasional arrests still make headlines, but they are reminders of the past rather than signs of present dominance. The FBI no longer considers them the central threat to American society that they once were. Instead, their story serves as a reminder of how power rises and falls, and how institutions dedicated to justice can outlast even the most entrenched organizations. In the end, the legacy of the Gambinos is not just about organized crime. It is about the resilience of law enforcement, the adaptability of government agencies, and the enduring principle that no matter how long it takes, justice can prevail. From Carlo Gambino's cautious empire to John Gotti's downfall, the arc of the family mirrors the arc of American law enforcement itself, growing more sophisticated, more connected, and ultimately more effective. The name remains famous, but its meaning has changed. Once a symbol of untouchable power, it now stands as proof that no empire, however carefully built, can withstand the persistence of justice. That is the true legacy of the Gambino crime family, a cautionary tale and a lasting victory for those who work tirelessly to bring it down. As we reach the end of the long and complicated story of the Gambino crime family, one thing becomes clear. This was never just about a single organization. It was about the constant struggle between those who sought power outside the law and the government institutions determined to uphold it. For decades, the Gambinos symbolized everything that seemed untouchable about organized crime in America. Yet their eventual decline showed that no matter how powerful, no empire lasts forever when faced with persistence, patience, and the rule of law. Looking back to Carlo Gambino's early years, it is remarkable how quietly he built his empire. He avoided the flamboyance of his contemporaries, kept a low profile, and relied on subtlety rather than spectacle. To the FBI of his era, he was almost a ghost, known, suspected, but rarely within reach. In many ways, his ability to evade prosecution for so long frustrated law enforcement and forced them to rethink their strategies. This early chapter set the tone for everything that followed. It reminded the government that dismantling organized crime would not be achieved in weeks or even years, but in decades. Paul Castellano's leadership brought a shift. With his lavish Staten Island estate and business-first approach, he presented a very different face to the world. For federal agents, Castellano's reign was both an opportunity and a challenge. His wealth and visibility made him a prime target, but his corporate-style management kept him insulated. Still, it was during this time that the government's use of wiretaps, surveillance, and the RICO Act began to pay off. Castellano may not have been brought down by prosecutors directly. His downfall came from within the family, but the groundwork for future convictions was being laid all around him. Then came John Gotti. Unlike Gambino, Gotti relished the spotlight. He became a media figure, smiling outside courthouses, gracing the covers of magazines, and earning the nickname the Teflon Don after beating case after case. To the public, he seemed larger than life. To the FBI, he was a challenge that could not go unanswered. Years of painstaking investigation eventually bore fruit. With wiretaps, informants, and relentless surveillance, prosecutors finally secured the evidence needed to convict him. Gotti's life sentence was more than just the end of a man. It was the end of an era. The years that followed were marked by a steady decline. Federal agencies continued applying pressure, targeting the family's finances, unions, and networks. Each prosecution weakened the structure further. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the once feared Gambino family had been reduced to fragments. They still existed, but without the dominance or influence that had once made them a household name. The government, meanwhile, evolved. The fight against the Gambinos taught lessons that extended far beyond organized crime. The same tools used against the Mafia were later applied to terrorism cases, financial crimes, and international cartels. The RICO Act, once controversial, became a cornerstone of modern prosecution strategies. Witness protection programs saved lives and encouraged insiders to cooperate, breaking the code of silence that had long shielded organized crime. Each of these advancements had roots in the long war against the five families, and the Gambinos in particular. The cultural impact cannot be ignored either. Books, films, and television shows borrowed heavily from the legends of the Gambinos and their counterparts. Yet the dramatization often masked the harsh reality. In truth, their empire was built not on glamour, but on exploitation, and it was undone not by chance, but by methodical investigation. Law enforcement's victory was not quick, not flashy, but it was complete. And so, what is the legacy of the Gambino crime family today? To the public, the name still carries weight, conjuring images of fedoras, expensive suits, and whispered deals in smoky back rooms. To scholars and criminologists, it represents one of the most influential organized crime families in American history. But to the FBI, prosecutors, and federal agents who spent their careers in the shadows, the legacy is something else entirely. It is a reminder that patience works, that surveillance pays off, that no one is beyond the reach of justice. The rise and fall of the Gambinos also offers a broader lesson about the nature of power. For decades, they seemed invincible, embedded in industries, politics, and unions. But every empire has its weaknesses. For the Gambinos, it was overconfidence, internal divisions, and the relentless march of law enforcement innovation. In the end, their downfall was inevitable. Not because they made mistakes, though they did, but because history shows that power gained outside the law cannot endure. Today, the Gambino name is more history than threat. Remnants may linger, but the age of untouchable bosses ruling from New York mansions is over. In its place stands a legacy of justice, a story of how determined government agencies, through trial and error, built the tools needed to confront organized crime head-on. And so, as the final chapter closes, we are left with a simple truth. The Gambino family once stood as a symbol of fear, wealth, and influence. Now they stand as a symbol of something greater, the resilience of justice and the unshakable principle that no empire, no matter how powerful, can last forever when the rule of law holds firm.